Yes, is this the Betamax Blocker fan club? What do you mean disconnected? Oh, hello? Bad call anyway. About a month ago, we talked about the Universal Cinema Classics Collection, a series of titles released on the Universal label, sharing similar artwork, highlighting great films from the studio from the 30s up through the late 1940s. In this last video, which you can find on my channel, I highlighted the first 8 titles. Now I'm going to go back and do the other 8, and we'll see the complete set of 16 at the end. Like last time, I'll go in chronological order for the movies, and I'll show you a similar film or a related film that I felt helps to drive some of the major points home. Thank you very much for watching the last video, and if you haven't, by all means, go do that now and come back and see this. So let's kick off, you saw it already, 1932's No Man of Her Own, the only film that paired Clark Gable and Carole Lombard together. They weren't married yet, and they wouldn't be for quite some time, but it gives them a chance to sort of play opposite each other, and you can see some spark in there that maybe led to their marriage much later on. A lot of people think No Man of Her Own is a screwball comedy because both Gable and Lombard did their share of 1930s farces and comedies. Look at things like Gable's ever-popular It Happened One Night with Claudette Colbert. Keep her in mind because we'll be talking about her a lot today. Or maybe you might think of Carole Lombard for My Man Godfrey, or To Be or Not to Be, which was her last film. But, you know, in all honesty, No Man of Her Own really isn't a comedy. It's more of a drama with occasional comedy elements. It prefigures films more like The Apartment. It's serious at its core. Clark Gable, a professional gambler, trying to get his life figured out, trying to figure out how he can romance this girl but also keep his career as a professional card shark a secret, that sort of thing. Lombard's quite good in it too. She's in love with him, but she realizes he's not really the best guy. You know, it's not one of my favorites, but it's an interesting film, and because it's the early 30s, kind of racy, it's got some good gags in there that wouldn't fly just a few years later. A good one to watch. Not really a household name, not a favorite of too many people, but definitely an interesting look into these two stars' careers, I would say. Speaking of 1932, next one up, The Sign of the Cross, featuring Charles Laughton as Nero, Claudette Colbert as Empress Poppaea, and Frederick March as the great Roman centurion Marcus Superbus. Now, Cecil B. DeMille loved epics, and today he is best remembered for some of his great religious epics, notably, of course, 2 different versions of the Ten Commandments. Here is the fancy deluxe box. It has both the silent version and the 1950s one with Charlton Heston, both directed by Cecil B. DeMille. He made Samson and Delilah as well, and he made a very similar film just a couple years later, Cleopatra. We'll come back to this in a moment. The Sign of the Cross is interesting because it's not really a religious epic. It's more of a historical one, showing how Christians were persecuted and the genocide against them in ancient Rome. It's very well cast, it's very well acted, and it doesn't have a lot of really hokey moments in it. The Ten Commandments goes overboard. It takes itself very seriously as a religious film and that sort of thing. The Sign of the Cross, not quite so much. Today, this is probably best remembered for the scenes of gratuitous violence, including a decapitation, a naked woman being eaten by crocodiles, and so on, gladiators battling, those sorts of things, and also for a lot of weird sexual content, and actually has an LGBT following because of all the scenes of implied homoeroticism, which again would not fly just a few years later. But Claudette Colbert, who is perfectly cast as Poppaea, she's even better as Poppaea than she was as Cleopatra a couple years later, but she has a scene where she bathes in milk and you can tell she's naked. Emperor Nero has a very handsome young man fixed to the side of his throne, that sort of thing. A lot of that kind of content that wouldn't pass muster. But The Sign of the Cross is probably my favorite DeMille film, just because it's a relatively simple story set against a very interesting historical background. Well acted, well directed. I like it a lot. Now, one thing I talked about last time was that there aren't really many special features on these DVDs. Usually there's a trailer, maybe a commentary or an introduction by a famous film historian or something like that, but nothing major. I thought the alternate, I should say, reinstated, that's not even the right word I want either. In 1944, an additional prologue was shot for this film, and then scenes that were in the movie were edited out, like those gratuitous sex and violence scenes. I thought that that added in prologue, that thing that came after the fact, would be on this DVD. It's not. It's a series of U.S. soldiers flying over Rome and looking down at the city and talking about it. It is not on this disc. So figured I would mention that because when we talked about Scarface in the last video, it has the alternate ending, which is really interesting, but not the case this time. We just get the actual 1932 cut, and that's all. None of those later frills. Next up, 1939, Claudette Colbert again. We'll be talking about her a lot today. In Midnight. Midnight is one of those 1930s comedies that it's all about relationships, but at the same time it's very conservative and it's very classy and it's very tasteful. And it has one of those bizarre Byzantine plots that could only happen in a 1930s romantic comedy. In this case, where John Barrymore, in one of his last great films, hires Claudette Colbert, who's broken out of work, to steal his wife, Mary Astor, her lover, away from her so he can re-romance his wife, but she falls in love with a taxi driver played by Don Amici, but even though they're in love, they fight all the time. You get the idea. It's a great, classy story. It's very silly. It's very fun. And actually, it fits in quite well with other films at the time. Those were sort of married but sort of not comedies like The Awful Truth. The Awful Truth isn't the only one. There are several others. My Favorite Wife, Too Many Husbands, The Doe Girls, all those sorts of things. It's kind of cut from that same cloth. But Midnight has, it's set in Paris, so it has a lot of class, has a lot of glitz, a lot of glamour. It's a fun movie to watch and a great sample of the wonderful sort of sparkling comedies of that time. Speaking of comedies, let's talk about Christmas in July. So Christmas in July is a very simple story, kind of one of those 1940s romantic fairy tale kind of things where a young man, as part of a prank, imagines that he won a big radio slogan contest. He didn't actually win it, but he decides to take his winnings, not realizing yet they're imaginary, and purchase some nice gifts for the whole community and have kind of a Christmas in July. And then of course someone finds out about it and hijinks ensue. Christmas in July is probably best remembered today as being one of the first movies directed by Preston Sturges. Here is the wonderful Preston Sturges box set. It includes this film and another one that we'll talk about here in a moment. But Christmas in July was only his second movie. The Great McGinty was the first. And Christmas in July, it's short, it's sweet, it's a silly, sappy love story. A lot of S's there. But, for what it is, it's just fun and innocuous, and it's only about an hour long. You can't go wrong. So keep Preston Sturges on the back of your mind here, because we'll come back to him. We got to talk about My Little Chickadee, also from 1940. So last time I talked about Mae West in She Done Him Wrong, probably one of her, I would say probably her most famous film, not even one of them, easily her most famous one. My Little Chickadee was an attempt to pair her and the man himself, W.C. Fields. I don't know that it quite works. A lot of the, I guess, production gossip was that her and Fields couldn't stand each other. I believe that her and Fields both constantly insisted that the film should showcase them and sort of minimize the other. I believe that. And I think the movie is so divided against itself that it doesn't work as well as it could. There are scenes that go great lengths where the two don't interact. There are scenes that Mae West, gets several songs, W.C. Fields gets several little solo bits of comedy, and it just doesn't quite gel as well as it could. And you could pair W.C. Fields with several different women and have, silly hijinks. And you could also pair Mae West with a variety of leading men, and she'd get some nice, little ribald jokes in there. But those two just don't really gel, I think. And it's a shame because this could have been a lot better. It is also a Western, so it's like a period piece kind of thing. And that, I think, hurts it a little bit too. W.C. Fields didn't do a lot of those. He was more, you know, I guess, up to date at that time. You know, a lot of his films were more commentaries on current society than they were historical treatises. But it's definitely a must-see for Mae West fans and for W.C. Fields fans. So there's more potential there than what was realized. It's not a bad movie, but it's not one I'd recommend for people getting into either one of those stars. Let's go back to Preston Sturges now and talk Hail the Conquering Hero. So Preston Sturges made a couple films with a man named Eddie Bracken, today probably best remembered for supporting roles in Home Alone 2 and National Lampoon's Vacation. He was the owner of Wally World, that sort of thing. He made a very famous comedy in 1944 called The Miracle of Morgan's Creek, which is a surprisingly risque comedy about pregnancy and ends with all kinds of gags comparing the birth of Betty Hutton's possibly illegitimate child to the birth of Christ. It was kind of ahead of its time in a lot of ways. I could see why audiences in 1944 didn't take too kindly to it. The other Preston Sturges vehicle for 1944 was, again, Hail the Conquering Hero. And that one involves Eddie Bracken as a Marine who is not allowed to serve, who has to work in a factory. He's discharged due to his hay fever. So a group of actual Marines helps him sort of, you know, trick his fellow townspeople into believing he's a war hero. And he comes back home and all of a sudden he's thrust into politics and all this kind of stuff that he didn't want, but since everyone thinks he's this great warrior, they want to give him as much as they can. Definitely a commentary on 1940s sort of hero worship and how the war was shaping life at home, that sort of stuff. It is a good film, very heavy-handed, I think, in some places, but all in all, it's worth a look. You know, it's got some great gags in there, and Preston Sturges, almost every movie he made was quite good. I can't recommend this box set enough. And yeah, you know, just a nice, kind of a different take on that World War II culture. And speaking of different takes on World War II, let's talk Claudette Colbert again. So we've seen her in a historical drama, we've seen her in a screwball comedy. Now let's see her as an army nurse with So Proudly We Hail. So 1944, World War II had been raging, the US was very heavily involved, things weren't always going well. So Proudly We Hail was a film designed to sort of appeal to women and to show women's roles in the war, that kind of thing, and how they became vital members of both military and civilian life. It's very similar to this film, Since You Went Away. This was sort of the big budget, you can see it's 2 videos, so you know it's important. Sort of the big budget, you know, look at a woman's role in World War II, that kind of thing. So Proudly We Hail is much more subtle, but I think it's a better film. And honestly, Veronica Lake, who mostly did comedies and that sort of thing, and a few film noirs, is really good in this as an army nurse who has just an intense hatred for the Japanese for a very personal reason. But this is a really interesting movie, and I like it a lot. And Claudette Colbert is very subdued and very believable, you know, as a woman who's thrust into these dangerous situations, but she's tough, she's resilient, she's smart, she'll persevere. And this film is a great credit to the women who served in World War II, I think. And kind of explaining to those at home the importance of their role over there, just as much as over here. Alright, tape fell over, that's all. Last one, and my least favorite of all the titles in this series, Unconquered. And we're back to Cecil B. DeMille again. So I really like The Sign of the Cross. I talked about 10 Commandments and Cleopatra. They're fun films to watch. They're kind of full of themselves. I cannot get into Unconquered. It's actually a drama set during the French and Indian War, also known as the 7 Years' War, depending on what part of the world you're in. And Gary Cooper plays a frontiersman who purchases a slave, Paulette Goddard, and could potentially free her and make her his wife, that sort of thing. So it's an interesting concept for a film. If you were to buy a slave with the intention to marry them, could you do that? But the movie gets caught up in a bunch of other different pursuits too. There's all this stuff about gun running to Native Americans, And Another Man, played by Howard Da Silva, is Cooper's rival for Goddard's hand in marriage, that sort of thing. The Native American chieftain is played by Boris Karloff because 1940s casting. What can you do? And in the end, it fits in though with DeMille's big frontier dramas. Here's a VHS of 1939's Union Pacific, which again, this big sprawling historical adventure filled with danger and intrigue. But Unconquered, it takes that pretentiousness and that sort of stiffness that we see in the big ones like the Ten Commandments, and it doesn't really have much humor. It doesn't really have much character. It's just such a stodgy film, and I don't think Cooper's very good in it, which is unusual, because he was cast in a lot of films that didn't really suit him, like Casanova Brown, The Fountainhead, Love in the Afternoon, but he still gives a good performance. Even though it definitely isn't his type of thing, he does show quite a bit of professionalism and character, and he's still worth watching. But this one, again, I just can't get into it. And I'd say of all 16, the only one I would say, yeah, you know, give this a pass. It's not that interesting. But maybe you like it. If you do, by all means, feel free to let me know. Feel free to say in the comments below what you think of any or all of these films. Okay, here we are down on the floor of the display room, and we're going to make a nice little shelf here for our cinema classics. So again, here are all 16 titles in the series. All Quiet on the Western Front, Scarface, No Man of Her Own, The Sign of the Cross, She Done Him Wrong, Easy Living, Midnight, Christmas in July, My Little Chickadee, The Major and the Minor. This won't go on the shelf. This goes on my Billy Wilder display in my TV room. But I do want to mention all the titles here. Oh, it will go on the shelf. Arabian Nights, Going My Way, So Proudly We Hail, Hail the Conquering Hero, Unconquered, and The Heiress. So that's 16 movies spanning 1930 all the way to 1949. And for now, they can all be together there till I find something else I like better. I hope you enjoyed watching this video. Please check out part 1 if you didn't before. And until next time, my friends, I'll see you later. Have a good one.